Remembrance Day is going to look different this year. People won't be able to gather the way they usually do, but families across this country will still honor those who fought and never came home. More than a century ago, it was not only the First World War that led to millions of deaths, but a flu pandemic. And for some families, it was a double blow. Redmond Shannon has the story of one of those families.
So this is a picture of James and Ellen taken in 1916.
Genealogist Eunice Robinson lives in the past, unlike her husband Barry.
My husband is the original non-gen, and the non-gen is the term I coined to say somebody who could absolutely care less about genealogy.
But exploring Barry's family history is one of the most interesting projects she's worked on. In 1907, his great-grandfather James Baird Brown left Scotland with his wife and children to start a new life in Winnipeg. 7 years later, war broke out and their sons James Jr. and George enlisted with Canada's 44th Battalion. Their father, then 53, wanted to fight too, so he lied about his age, saying he was 43.
You hear about the youngers often saying they're older, but rarely do you hear about the older saying that they're younger. So I guess he felt extremely patriotic. I believe when he finally got to England, they thought, hey, you're too old, fella. So they put him to work in the quartermaster's office, where I guess he did quite a good job.
In October 1916, George was killed in battle, one of the more than 24,000 Canadian deaths in the brutal and infamous Somme offensive. George is buried at the Adanac Military Cemetery in northern France. Before the war was over, James Sr., by then aged 55, was discharged for being overage and returned to Winnipeg. Just weeks after the war ended, James Jr. married a British war bride, tying the knot at this church in London. Around that time, James Sr. returned to Europe to find his younger son's grave. While in London, he most likely stayed on this street at James Jr.'s home. But he contracted influenza during the Spanish flu pandemic that was killing millions, and he died, aged 56.
Who can envision what the world would have been like with a previous pandemic? And this has really brought it home, and you kind of wonder where you really are, maybe put in a position where you have no control over getting this disease.
James Jr. returned to Winnipeg 2 years later. He died there in 1953, taking with him the answer to a mystery about his dad's final journey to Europe.
I don't really know if he ever found George's graveyard. That was done under the Canadian War Graves Commission, so a good chance that he may not have. I don't really know all those answers, and unfortunately, I don't think there's anyone living that still does.
Perhaps it's enough to know that James Sr. paid the ultimate price trying to find his son's final resting place. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.